and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening we're going to discuss a particular thing about the new kind of scholarship that's emerging in digital space that can transcend all languages, all nations, all boundaries, basically, and that's the whole point of digital scholarship. It can now meet people wherever they are around the world and bring them together in new kinds of groups to look at very interesting problems that have never been possible before the electronic age. We couldn't convene international seminars prior to the availability of the internet. Sure, you could make a transatlantic call before and something could be piped in with very special equipment, but now it's available on something as simple as a cell phone. You can log on to an address in the cell phone and get into an international conference, a multilingual one with translations and everything else. So the technology has, in effect, exceeded our capacity to think about how we should use the technology to do new things, not just the same old things, but new kinds of things. And that's part of what we want to look at today. The fact that we can start to use this technology to create international communities and facilitate those communities in having new kinds of exchange. So we're going to be looking at the advantages of one of these kinds of groups that's doing this, called the Africa Map Circle, which scholars can join fairly easily. And it has a lot of advantages that we're going to be underscoring here. You can get to it very quickly by just scanning in the QR code. Almost all cameras have a free app for scanning in QR codes like this. Some of them actually have them built into the photography app on your phone. That is, if you tap the photograph capacity of an iPhone, some of the software that's built into the newer iPhones has the QR capacity for reading it right within the camera. So you don't need a separate app. It's already part of the photo equipment on an iPhone. So some of the advantages of joining the African Map Circle become pretty apparent when you see what it can do. The African Map Circle is a project of the African Historical Graphics Archives. It serves as an online community of scholars devoted to studying maps of Africa. Its members are encouraged to share research on historical maps of specific regions of Africa or of the continent as a whole. More generally, the Circle seeks to promote research on the cartography of Africa and to facilitate the development of innovative teaching techniques in this newly evolving multidisciplinary domain of African studies. You can get access to it by going to the website african-graphics, sorry, not dot, it's a dash, african-graphics-archive.net. In any case, long before the period of formal colonial European control in Africa, the history of Africa's interaction with Europe and well beyond Europe was well recorded in a lot of documents. Some of them were written documents, but many of them were graphic documents. Graphic documents which are very rare, but can now be, in effect, shared because of the capacity of photographic equipment, digitization equipment, and communications equipment that's available in the internet age. So how would we adapt that equipment and capacities to address this whole issue of sharing new kinds of data across all known boundaries? Well, the African Historical Graphics Archive is an effort to, in the digital age, to expand and enlarge the work that's already begun by scholars on looking at maps very closely. They've looked at maps of Africa for the last 500 years, basically, and they've shared this in seminars, in lectures, in specialized publications in the past, but now there's a capacity to share it in a new kind of way. One of the persons who worked a lot on the images of Africa back in the 1960s, 50s and 60s really, was a scholar named Philip Curtin, who put out a book in '64 called The Image of Africa, and it was so popular it came out later in a 2-volume set, which he expanded a bit, same title, but Philip Curtin kept 2 volumes before us to think about the images of Africa before 1900, basically. Its date is British ideas and action as 1750 through 1850. So in a way it's a 100-year period in the study of African material. Actually it's 1780 through 1850, so it's less than 100 years, only 70 years. But we've tried to extend the period before that 1780 and after his terminal point of 1850, and to extend the technology with the digital material to move beyond what he did in 1973 with these 2 important volumes. He was himself a scholar in the first instance of the Jamaican Revolution back in the 1830s, and his work on Africa came after his work on Jamaica. He had in mind the whole Atlantic system in some sense. But it invited a lot of historians to look at the printed word in this earlier period, what amounted to just after the American Revolution, right through to 1850, and they all started to look, in effect, at the maps that were printed in these books. Not just the books and the texts, but the maps that went with them. And that, in effect, is what is being given a brand new impulse with the technology of digitization and the capacity of the internet to get these things out across all institutional boundaries. It can start with individual travel accounts or encyclopedias and compendia of travel literature, and usually does start that way. The texts in these older books are supplemented by maps that are fold-out maps. But the digital technology that we have recently available allows us to digitize that map separate from the book. You could reproduce books before fairly easily from typeface of the printed page, but it really is only recently, by that I mean in the last 10 or 15 years, that we've had the capacity to digitize maps on a scale that's useful for study. Those maps can also be geo-referenced on the surface of a known geographic impression of Africa, and the maps, when placed with geo-referencing, the latitude and longitude accuracy, reveal a great deal about the slave trade in these particular areas. Along the whole coast of Africa, there were a whole series of maps, and those are variously detailed depending upon the specific interests of specific European traders in this coastal period. Some maps are very detailed indeed, so that a small river like this, the Gambia River, gets an extraordinary detailed map, in part because it was very important during the slave trade. And those can be geo-referenced, all these maps, in a way that then becomes a clue to what we should be looking at in the modern day. These maps of the 18th century, 1727 this one was, basically show where an archaeologist might want to go look in the present-day world, because a lot is indicated on that map as being important during the era of the slave trade. Same is true with the offshore islands, like the island of Gorée off the coast of Senegal, right off the port of Dakar. It had maps from an early period. If you look at those maps, you get a great idea of where to do some archaeology on that island. In fact, the whole coast of what's now known as Ghana, and was then known as the Gold Coast, or the Côte d'Or de Guinée, as the French called it, is possible to look at in great detail. And you can zoom in on this by calling up various resolutions of the map and, in effect, parachuting in to smaller and smaller units, and eventually start looking at individual forts. This is a French map, so it refers to Dixcove as un fort anglais. So it's an English fort. And in this French text, there's supplementary material showing a number of things, among which you can learn about plantations of crops right outside that castle. Very interesting question of what those were. You can also get a sense of the plan of the castle, what the French call le plan de Fort Anglois, that is the floor plan. You could see where the slaves were kept, you could see where the food was kept, you could see where the munitions and armaments were kept. All of these things are now digitally available, and that means they can be analyzed by many different traditions, not only the French and the English, but obviously the Africans, who are the lead scholars in this region, can now get access to the primary material in their own history. Primary material being the very early printed editions of maps and plans. Now this is quite useful, especially for anyone doing archaeology, but anyone doing the history of this area as well, because this kind of structure didn't go away. In fact, it can be looked at from a number of different angles today. It's been whitewashed, and in fact it is an impressive fort in Dixcove, Ghana. You can even see it from space. If you go to Google Earth, you can call it up from space and see what it looks like from there. In fact, it's instructive to do so because Google Earth is a very powerful tool for looking at things immediately and recognizing, in a sense, what's happened. And you can zoom in various angles and learn one heck of a lot about what's going on. If you did a 2D, that is a two-dimensional look at it, you could move right in over the top of it. A 3D dimensional view of it would give you the simulation of a helicopter trip around the fort, which itself is very interesting because it shows the relationship to the little cove of Dixcove, as it's called. And you can see, in fact, if we stop it a second and go into the two-dimensional view, you can see all of the canoes that are right down there that are deployed by fishermen nowadays, but were very much part of the trade during the slave trading period, taking slaves from the fort out to the awaiting ships. Furthermore, you can, in the digital age, benefit from the work of people from Ghana who've put together a series of connected itineraries for you to look at. This is courtesy of the United States Navy, which takes a lot of these pictures on a regular basis and shares them with Google Earth, but the information on the ground truthing of it, as it were, is provided by people who take pictures locally. And you can highlight that and, in fact, start to click on that and be taken into a kind of parachuting view of different points along that blue-lined itinerary, made available to us through the street view in Google Earth. This is what the fort looks like from down below, and you can reseed a bit and see it at a greater distance, or you can, in effect, parachute in from the top. If we go ahead again off of the street view, but call up that map, that schema, from within Google Earth again, the street view, and instead of walking up the beginning part here, suppose we jump right into the inside of the fort, you'll see very quickly that we are now looking out from the fort to Dick's Cove in Ghana. That is the cove itself, and we can look around and study the different features of this fort from inside it, in this case on top of the parapet that defends it. If you start doing that, you can see a number of things that are very interesting that we've talked about in several other contexts. But among other things, you see that most of the armaments are pointed out to the sea, which is logical because they had to defend their control of this particular spot from rival European slave traders. In this case, this is an English fort, and you can tell that by looking in detail at the markings on the cannon. This was George III. Rex is the indication of a king. King George III was the king of England at the time that the Americans were declaring their independence from England. We often refer to him as Nutty King George because he had, in effect, a mental difficulty and emotional breakdown at one point. But in any case, he, as it were, was in control of this castle, obtaining slaves at the time that the Americans were declaring their independence. Well, you can have a look around and, in effect, relate a whole lot of series of European questions to this whole question of the slave trade, including how did they make this incredibly intricate architecture in this area without the aid of animals? Well, that's pretty interesting, because there's a heck of a lot of labor in making one of these medieval castles on the coast of West Africa, and you can start to ask and inquire about questions like this. If you go back to the 2D version of it, you can see that the whole region is, in effect, a coastal region of Ghana, and has a series of forts like this all up and down the coast. It's not just here in Dick's Cove, but it's entirely throughout the rest of the region of West Africa. That there are 30 to 40 forts in this particular area, and they can be viewed in great detail if you have the time and research background to look into it. This, for example, is another coastal fort here that we talked about earlier, that map of the offshore island of Gorée. And you can parachute into that offshore island, and again, courtesy of the United States Navy, taking satellite photos of this, you can figure out what it looks like from above. Then you can parachute in and try to look at the street view again. Once again, you can go to the outside defense of these fortresses and take a look, or you can parachute right into the inside of this fort. This is an extraordinary facility made available by African scholars to the rest of us in the world to look at what the fort looks like from inside, but not just inside the courtyard, inside the different islands I call them, then inside the different rooms and museum exhibits that are available to be seen. This is an extraordinary new kind of capacity for international scholarship that hasn't been available before. And now it has the capacity to take us from one side of the world to the other almost instantaneously. And as part of the Africa Map Circle, you can learn about the digital scholarship projects that are developing in African studies all over the world. In Europe, in Africa itself, in Japan, as it turns out, because they have all of this technology available, they're making great use of it. So in China as well. China is developing a very active interest in Africa these days, and not just the coastal ports, which you can now visit sort of one after the other in a place like Ghana. There are historical study projects going on each one of these forts at this point. and especially their defenses and the logistics of the slave trade. Cape Coast Castle is one. This is the one from Senegal. Other groups are working in the digital humanities to do research on mapping the slave trade. Get all these maps together and put them in a kind of new anthology. In the process of creating this archive, there are extensive benefits on several levels to scholars of Africa all over the world. The technologies, techniques, and software that are in effect being developed in the process of creating the virtual map archive is now extensible in virtually all directions for future university research around the world. Maps and images can now be shared for scholarly communication and new platforms for coordinated research on a vast range of topics, not just maps. The early ethnographic information is stored in these things as well. So from antique maps to the edge of space, imaging Africa in the digital age is making a lot of new types of learning available. We can learn and teach from the maps, and you can get access to these things on a regular basis now through something as simple as your cell phone. As I say, if you scan in the QR code here, you'll get right to it. You haven't signed up yet for it or anything like that, but once you sign up for it, you can get regular updates on this kind of material and see what other scholars are doing around the world in the area of the digital humanities concerning Africa. It's a very useful new platform for exchanging information, and that exchange of information is what stimulates a whole new range of questions. There are old documents, but new questions. Why? Well, because we have a new capacity to look at this material. If you can look at the material in detail and call it up on a level of, say, individual prints like this, for example, that allow you to look at what might be called the bird's eye view of what was going on at the time. This is the Dix Cove Castle down from the edge of the parapet, and you can see the different communities located in each area, and the Dutch forts and the English forts looking at Accra. This is further down the coast, looking at one another that close to each other with the slave ships in the background. Well, you can understand that there'd be a great deal of interest in recapturing the history of that kind of encounter in Africa. Take a look at this Dutch print. This is a print that again shows how close these castles were to one another. It's printed in a way that the title on the bottom is in Dutch, but the title on the top is in French. Now that's an interesting question in itself. Why are map makers and print makers focusing on both the Dutch and the French in their renditions of these things? Here's the French title, Vue du Sud-Ouest, des forts anglois et hollandais. So they're looking at English forts and Dutch forts, but they're talking about it in English and Dutch as well as French language right here. Now, you could ask yourself, why is that going on? In part, it has to do with the investments. And that's what this kind of new scholarship is leading us to question. The Africa Map Circle is a new effort, and it's something that you ought to look into joining.